So I've spent a lot of time playing Borderlands 4, and most of that time has been spent farming. I've spent 8 to 10 hours a day, nearly every day, trying to farm every single phosphine gun in the game, and so far, at least as of writing the script, I think I'm one of the few people who has actually gotten every available shiny drop legitimately. This is all to say, I'm extremely familiar with the loot system in the game. There's been a significant amount of discussion about the loot system and drop rates recently, and I've thought a lot about how I'd fix these issues. The main issue I have with the loot system is crowded drop pools. Now, if you don't know what I mean by this, let me explain. It just means when a boss drops more than a single specific item, or in other words, having more than one dedicated drop. Think the Warrior from Borderlands 2, or Irajira from the pre-sequel, or every boss in the base game of Borderlands 3. When a boss has more than a single dedicated drop in their loot pool, it causes a problem of trying to balance the rate the player sees any legendary from that boss, and the rate the player sees the legendary they actually want from the boss. This leads to one of two solutions. The first solution being you make each item have a relatively high drop rate, so on any given run, the player has a decent chance to see the item they want, but this also has the major drawback of spamming the player with legendaries. This was the solution that Borderlands 3 went with, and it heavily contributed to the legendary fatigue that a lot of players felt in that game. While world drops were also a factor in that, I don't think this can be understated as a major contributor to it. The second solution is what Borderlands 4 does currently, and is also similar to how Borderlands 2 handled its crowded loot pools. That being taking the normal drop rate and dividing by the number of different drops the boss has. This makes it so the player isn't spammed with legendaries, but also that getting the item you actually want is far rarer than it should be to make it satisfying to farm. For example, farming the bunker in Borderlands 2, he has a 10% chance to drop any of his dedicated drops, but he has 3 items in his loot pool. So instead of a 1 in 10 chance to see the item you want, it's actually a 1 in 30 chance, which just doesn't feel great. Now the question is, how do we fix this? How do we change the loot system so that at every farm you get the drop you want in a reasonable amount of time and you aren't spammed with legendaries to the point that it just doesn't feel special to get them anymore? A lot of people have suggested just flat out buffing the drop rates, raising them across the board so every drop is 7% or 10% or even 15%. But on its own, I don't think this is a good solution. I think if you flat out buff drop rates, we just end up in the same situation that Borderlands 3 was in, where you are just getting spammed with legendaries way too frequently. I think the only solution is to spread out the loot pools so that every boss has ideally only a single drop. That might sound impossible though. There's currently 146 drops that are dedicated drops, and are only 41 farmable bosses in the game. They would need to add like 100 enemies for the player to farm, right? But what if I told you those 100 enemies are already in the game with no additions needed? I took it upon myself to complete every side quest and replay every main quest, and counted every single uniquely named enemy that could even remotely potentially have a dedicated drop. And the final total I came up to was 140 uniquely named enemies in the game that could potentially have a dedicated drop. So job done, right? 146 total drops, 140 named enemies. Basically every item gets a single drop source, and there's just a couple with 2 drops? Well, not exactly. I'll be honest, in counting the named enemies, there were some that I was pretty lenient on counting, like McCracky, the NPC that you crack his back in that one side quest. I mean, he does have a name, and you do kill him. Luke could theoretically pop out of him when he dies, but it doesn't really feel right. There's also some instances, like in the Cat's Pajamas side quest, you fight Katie Cattinson and her 9 cats, all at the same time, which if you gave them all dedicated drops, would be 10 different drops in one location, which also feels kinda unreasonable. So if I remove all the named enemies that felt unreasonable or unrealistic to have dedicated drops, we drop down to only having 112 named enemies, which is a lot farther from our 146 goal. But all is not lost. There is some wiggle room we have here. First thing is that 146 number counts every single legendary class mod separately. With the change they made to make it so you get far more class mods for the character you're playing as, I feel more than confident grouping these together into groups of 4, one of each character, exactly like they are in-game right now. That takes those 24 dedicated drops and makes it only 6, and also brings down the total we need to hit to 128. So the question now is, with 128 dedicated drops and only 112 farms, how do you distribute the last 16 items? Well, I think to start with, you can look at the big enemies in the game, namely the 3 vault bosses and the 3 main bosses in the story, being Soul, Ripper Queen Callus, and Vile Lictor. These are the enemies that currently drop class mods, and I'd keep those, but I think it'd be fair to give them an additional drop on top of their class mods, meaning they would each drop 1 set of 4 class mods and 1 additional item, giving 6 more items dedicated drop and only having 10 items left. From there, I don't think there's any perfect way to distribute the last 10 items. You could try giving them to more significant enemies, I suppose. Timekeeper, RJ, Driller Hole, Moon Callus could all potentially get a second drop. Ultimately though, it would lead to the game having 16 enemies with more than 1 item in their loot pool, and 96 enemies with only a single item that they drop, which is a massive improvement from where we are right now with only 41 crowded farms. And it's all accomplished without needing to add any new enemies or content to the game, just rearranging what already exists. Now that we've spread out the loot, the only question remaining is, what drop rate should these items have? I think a 5 to 7% drop rate would feel nice. I'm sure that number sounds scary to a lot of people, that a lot of people would think it's way too low. After all, in comparison to the rest of the games in the series, it is much lower. But Borderlands 4 does one thing so massively different than the other games in the series that I think a lower rate fits it way better. That one thing is farming. With the addition of the Moxie Encore machines and the removal of save quitting from the farming loop, farms in this game are so significantly faster than in previous games. It's so much faster, it's hard to actually compare them. But why still this number specifically? I think 5 to 7% would fulfill what I consider to be the golden rate for farming, which is at endgame farming, on average getting 1 drop every 7 to 12 minutes. That time range I think fits perfectly for the time input to reward output feeling. Just for reference, I've done a ton of endgame farming in Borderlands 2, and this 7 to 12 minute average is what I get in that game. So my feelings for it aren't based on nothing. If you want the dedicated drop system to feel like BL2's, then this is what you have to shoot for. With this average, it means that if you get lucky, you can get a drop in 1 to 2 minutes, and if you get unlucky, you might take 20 minutes for 1 drop. This 5-minute window feels like the perfect thing to shoot for in my eyes. With how fast farms are in Borderlands 4, you need this lower drop rate to achieve that. To just do some quick math, if a farm in this game has a 7% drop and takes 45 seconds to do, which a lot of farms can actually be done faster than that, it would take about 14 runs and about 10.5 minutes to get a drop on average, which to me sounds perfect. If you think drops should come faster or slower than that, of course you'll have a different opinion on the rates, but personally, I think this is what it should be. Some of you may also be thinking I'm contradicting myself here, because earlier in this video I said buffing the drop rates to 7% would be too high, and the major difference here is this is the drop rate after spreading out the loot, so the bosses only have 1 item. Currently, when most bosses have 3 items in their loot pool, buffing everything to 7% would mean you have a roughly 21% chance every run to get any legendary, which I think is way too high. Whereas what I'm suggesting is that once every farm only has 1 drop, then you can make it so all the drops are 7%, so you only have a 7% chance for a legendary every run. Thought I should clear that up just in case there was any confusion. There is 2 exceptions to this drop rate though, where I think rates should overall be higher. The first being those 16 enemies that have multiple items in their loot pools. I think a higher rate to help compensate for seeing the wrong items during your farm there would help the negative feeling associated with that. The second place being every Ripper drill site. The drill site farms are significantly slower than every other boss in the game because you have to do all the mobbing before the boss even spawns, which would mean giving them the same drop rate as the other bosses would ruin that 7 to 12 minute average I'm going for. So the Ripper sites should have higher drop rates to compensate for that. I don't know exactly how much slower they are, but I think you could pretty safely double the normal drop rates for them. So if it's 7% for a normal boss, it'd be 14% for the Ripper bosses. That's probably a pretty fair rate. It might need a bit of testing to really hone in though. The exact number doesn't really matter, but the point is they should be higher because they are slower farms. And that's it. That's pretty much all I would change in the loot system, and I think it would be practically perfect. spread out the loot using the already existing enemies in the game, and give the loot appropriate drop rates for the systems introduced. Let me know what you think of the idea. I always love hearing other people's takes on stuff like this. Who knows, maybe Gearbox will see this and actually consider it. But even if they don't, it was a fun little thought experiment. Also, I'm going to put a link in the description to the spreadsheet I made with all the named enemies and what quests they're in case anyone was curious about that information or the numbers there. There's also going to be a link to my Twitch channel down there. I'm live doing Borderlands stuff over there pretty much every day, so go ahead and check that out too.